So we're going to start with Peter Cohen. Peter has worked closely with hundreds of startups and entrepreneurs. He's invested in them, interviewed them, he's taught them how to be entrepreneurs. And today, he's going to tell us a little bit about how to pull together the best startup team. Peter.
Dia. Is that correct? Buen dia? Okay, great. Fantastic. Well, I'll get started. I wish I could speak in Portuguese, but unfortunately I only know maybe 10 words. So I'm not going to try any more right now. Maybe at the end I'll say muito obrigado or something like that. It's really been great to be here in Portugal. The reason I have enjoyed it so much is seeing the entrepreneurial spirit of the people here and meeting many of the entrepreneurs personally and hearing their passion for entrepreneurship. It makes me think that entrepreneurship is not something that is specific to a country. It's human nature. Entrepreneurship is part of human nature. And why is it part of human nature? I think it's part of human nature because people who start companies are hungry. And hungry is a human trait. It's deeply human. It crosses all nations. And when I think about creating and managing a startup team, at the heart of a startup is the idea of a hungry founder. And what do I mean by the hunger of a founder? I mean that the founder wants to create a world that the founder can live in and that the people that work with the founder can live in. They have a passion for not having somebody else tell them what to do. They have a vision of what their company can be, and they deeply want to bring that vision into reality, into being. And if you don't have that vision, if you don't have that passion, you should not be in a startup. You should not be running a startup. That passion is essential. The why of why you are starting a company is essential. And without it, you might as well not do a startup. I've invested in 6 private companies. Of those 6, 3 of them failed. The other 3 were sold for a total of $2 billion. And so the winners outweighed the losers. But I learned a lot from the ones that failed. And one of the things that I learned from the ones that failed is that if you're running a startup and you don't have a passion for the product, you don't know why you're there beyond maybe trying to make some quick money in the dot-com bubble, you should not be there. And as an investor, you should make sure you understand that there either is or is not that passion, that reason for starting the company before you invest. And creating and managing a startup team is one of 6 different choices that a CEO has to make in order to bring that vision and that passion for a new company into reality. And so I'd like to start by talking about my general framework here. These are the highlights, so if you listen to what I'm about to tell you now and decide you've had enough and want to leave, you'll get the essence of what I have to say. I'm working on a book called Hungry Startup Strategy. And Hungry Startup Strategy is going to be delivered to the publisher in March and published next November. But I have to teach a group of 25 MBA students from Babson College, where I teach, the essence of this book at the beginning of December. So I really need to finish chapter 7 between now and then. And this is what I'm talking to you about here is in chapter 6. So I just finished that before I got here, just in time to talk about this. So part of the book involves interviewing experts in the field of startups. One of them is a professor who teaches at Babson College. It's in Wellesley, Massachusetts. It's ranked #1 for entrepreneurship in the U.S. for the last 15 years. And one of my colleagues, he's in a different department, but I consider him a colleague, gave me his thoughts on some of these different startup decisions, including building a startup team. And he said that one of the key issues of a startup is that you have to make sure that you have both the skills of a leader and of a manager in a startup team. What do I mean by a leader versus a manager? Well, a leader is somebody with the vision. A leader is somebody who can inspire people. A manager is somebody who can make sure the trains run on time, who can make sure that the payroll checks get cut, that if a product has to be delivered, it is delivered on time. This is somebody who takes all the broad visions of the leader and turns them into practical activities in the organization that realize that vision. And in Les Charm's, who's the professor Les Charm, he told me that having both leader and manager skills within a company is critical. Now, you can have one individual that has both of those skills, but usually you don't have that. Another expert that I talked to is Howard Stevenson. Howard Stevenson retired as a professor of entrepreneurship at Harvard Business School earlier this year. And I've talked to him 6 times. I have a blog that I write on Forbes about startups called Startup Economy. I've interviewed him 6 different times. He's a man of tremendous wisdom. And his greatest idea in talking about building startup teams is the idea of avoiding eye strain. Now, what does eye strain mean? It means that the CEO always talks about him or herself. The egotism of the CEO causes more failure in startups than any other factor. That was his conclusion. A successful startup CEO has to be thinking about how to make the other people in the company successful. They are what I think of as a servant leader. They are serving the people in the organization. They always talk about we. They're trying to motivate people. They're trying to create success among the people in the organization. Another expert that I talked to was 2 people, actually, Michael Deering and Perry Kleben, who teach at Stanford. There's a program there called the Launchpad, which is a tremendous way of getting entrepreneurs going, and a really, really interesting place. And one of the things that they said was that they have this concept of design thinking, which, if you've already heard about this, I'll go through it pretty quickly. It basically means you develop a hypothesis, you basically develop a prototype to test that hypothesis, you get feedback from the market, you respond to that feedback, and you go through this iterative prototyping approach. Well, they suggest you can apply this same methodology to building the startup team. And what I mean by that is that the founders of the company ought to do an objective analysis of where their strengths are relative to the needs of the company in order to compete in the industry, and where their weaknesses are, and to identify those weaknesses, and to go out and try to use things like social networking to find people who can help close the gap in terms of those weaknesses. So use that sort of experimental, iterative approach to building the startup team. Based on what I've seen so far in my research, there are a couple of general things that I found in thinking about startup teams. The first one is to resist the urge to hire friends. A lot of startups will hire their own friends in the startup. Focus on competitive advantage is my other big idea, which is basically understand what you'll have to do well in the organization in order to succeed in the industry, and make sure that you have those skills on your team. And finally, another thing I want to talk about is cultivating the startup culture. If you are trying to have a startup culture, there's a really interesting guy that I talked to who heads a startup in Silicon Valley, and he is what I call Silicon Valley's startup doctor. Because what happens is he is head of a company called Axient, and he is passionate about culture. And he is so good at culture that other Silicon Valley startups, through the venture capital firm that invested in his company, bring him in to help other startup companies to develop their culture. And so I think that this is a really interesting idea, and a very important and central part of building a startup team is building that culture. So tell me when I'm going over my time. Okay, I'm good, great. These are the key points I want to make. I think that this is a little bit redundant to what I've already said, but I just want to reinforce 2 points. There are 2 kinds of skills that you need at the top. A leader who sets the vision for the company and brings people along, and a manager who can set specific goals and measure performance and promote the performers and cull those who can't make it. If you think about the companies that you're involved in, if you have both of these skills, fantastic. If you just have one or the other, you're in trouble. I mean, if you have a firm that just has a visionary and can't execute, you're in trouble. If you have a person who can execute but has no vision, you're in trouble. You need both. Howard Stevenson. He argues that companies need to change the phrase "I am" to the phrase "we can." The idea of using the word "we" a lot instead of the word "I," making people feel important, making people feel that they are making progress, treating people well, making them feel respected, reward them for skill and honesty rather than luck. These are the things that I think are really important skills in a CEO. I agree with Howard Stevenson that if you are leading an organization, you have to be able to treat those people well and maximize and get the most out of them because they are motivated to be there. Stanford's Launchpad. This is probably the most brilliant place I've seen in terms of applying an approach of design thinking, which is a four-step methodology of observing the world, developing a point of view, prototyping a solution that will solve the problem that you think is out there, and then what they call endless iteration, which is these learning loops where you provide a prototype to a customer, you get feedback, and you improve. But design thinking is also applicable not only to product development, which I think is where the idea originated, but also to the idea of how to hire people. And in doing that, they believe it's important to analyze the strengths and weaknesses of the founders, to look at the future of the business and figure out what skills will be needed to be successful in the future, to find the gaps, and to hire people who can close the capability gaps. And so what they do is they figure out the profiles of the people they need, and they urge the founders to go out onto LinkedIn and find people who fit those attributes. So it's a way of coming up with a fresh approach to building the startup team. The methodology in Hungry Startup Strategy suggests that we resist the urge to hire friends, build a founding team with the right capabilities, and create a strong culture. So the approach that I'm talking about is very similar to the one from the startup methodology at Stanford. And here's the final slide. Basically, I want to talk about this guy, Justin Moore, because he is an absolutely fascinating example of a culture doctor. First of all, what is culture? I mean, this is something I started working in a consulting firm back in '84, which was focusing on culture, and I really never quite understood what it was all about. But I think in talking to Justin, who's the CEO of a company called Axient, and I talked to him about the company, and then I met with him in Boston in October, and a really interesting discussion about culture. He is a passionate believer in it, and I think many in Silicon Valley, some of the people who have invested in him think of him as a real culture doctor. He believes that culture is a critical element to creating an organization. He has some specific values for his company, but I think it's important to point out that not every company needs to share his values. In fact, it would be a mistake for Axient's values to be applied to other companies. But just to give you some examples, his values are up there: integrity, teamwork, building inspired products, putting partners and customers first, and getting results. That is, it's interesting because he has sort of internalized those things. He repeats them all the time in the company. Everything that the company does is designed around making sure that people are living those values. I mean, one of the great mistakes that companies make, and for those of you who remember Enron, if you ever read their value statement or their mission statement or anything like that, it reads just like Axient's does. I mean, it's a wonderful value statement. But what really matters is putting those values into practice. If you don't put the values into practice, you're basically wasting everybody's time. So he focuses on how you can use these values to hire people, making sure that the people that you hire are people who really believe in those values. He told me the story about one person who accepted a position at the company. And after he accepted the position at the company, he said, look, I got an offer from another company that paid me 20% more. But I wanted to work for you because I really want to be part of this company. that's the kind of person that he wants to hire. And you know, that's just an example of the power of culture. It's also used in helping to decide who's going to get a promotion, in deciding who doesn't fit, in deciding how to structure the organization. It's all based on the values that he has and the way that he makes it part of the company all the time. Now, let's say you're a CEO of a company that doesn't have values or doesn't have a culture. I mean, basically you feel like, well, if I just hire people that are smart and tell them to do this, they'll do it. And what happens is that if they don't have a culture, sometimes, at least in the Silicon Valley companies...
1 minute, Peter.
Sorry?
1 minute.
Thank you. I'm almost done. That the companies are having turnover problems. They're having productivity problems. So he tells the CEOs where he's doctoring them, he says, look, the CEOs should ask themselves a couple questions. Who are you? You want to get them to figure out what's their real purpose, why they're there, what's important, what behaviors do you want to see people in your company perform, and how do you want them to act and make decisions. And then based on those values, a company can develop a culture. So that's it. Thank you.
Very much, Peter. So next, now that we've had a good idea here how to build a team, what to focus on when hiring, so how do you manage that team? How do you find your own style of managing? The name of this panel, Finding Your Management Style, it was very much inspired by conversations that I had with both Philip and Tony. And I would like to call up next Philip Rosedale. He's well, everybody knows that he's the founder, CEO and founder of Second Life. So, as CEO and founder of Second Life, he has found that having a special management style is a great advantage. So, without saying this again, Philip, please.
Great. Thank you. I've got it. Thank you. So, with the time we have, I thought what I would do is, before I get the opportunity later today to give more comments, is just focus on 3 very specific things that I did inside my company, inside Second Life, that were very explicit types of management styles and experiments. 3 things I'll tell you about that I bet very few, if anybody here, has ever done inside their own companies or even thought to do. Experiments that were taken from the unique nature of the startup challenge that I myself faced. I was the founder of Second Life. Second Life had some unusual properties. It was even more risky in that the idea was even less formed than many of the startup companies that I've heard from already here in Lisbon, and that you would traditionally hear about. So I had a bigger, crazier idea with more uncertainty about whether it would work and how it would be put together. The other problem was I was building something that had a really large number of small moving parts. I was building Second Life, which as a technology challenge was something like an operating system. It had all these little pieces that had to be built. And I really didn't believe that a conventional management style, or that I myself could successfully kind of plan out and diagram and design the whole thing that we had to build. So I took on an unusual set of experiments. It's kind of my style to try very different things. And I wanted to tell you about 3 of those that are perhaps thought-provoking for talking about finding your own internal management style that can be different and successful. I also have a big belief that the way we manage companies today is very unlikely to be the way we manage them in the near future. That we're in a time of disruptive change driven by communication and technology, and that disruptive change is about to very substantially alter what we think of even as a company and how people work together in a company. So let me tell you these 3 things I did. The first one was this thing called the Love Machine. A great name. In part, I thought that name would be charming because it would get people's attention. The Love Machine was a very simple idea with a very disruptive impact. Here's the idea. You're all working together in a company. There's a web page inside the company. You can pick the name of anybody else in this room, and you can send a message. Now that we did this was in the days before Twitter, but you can send a one-sentence message about that person to them. Amy, thank you for figuring out all the numbers on my report so quickly. You're cool. Send it. But here's the game. When you send that message to that other person, we have monitors all around the office. Everyone in the company sees the sender, the receiver, and what that sentence was. Boom. Moreover, when you go to do your performance review, a key component of it every quarter is that you can actually see the history of all these little bits of love, all these messages that other people in the company sent to you. So your valuation your performance in the company becomes measured by everybody else, by all these little pieces of input. And in fact, we used to go around and give people little pink envelopes on their desks every quarter, which contained cash, like $2 for every love that you got. And so everybody would get these little envelopes with cash inside it, and we'd all take each other out for drinks at the bar down the street. Now, this is a very successful tool. We actually built it into a commercial product, and it's been adopted by several other significant companies. For example, Yelp uses it. So it's an interesting, that's number one. Number two, second experiment. At the end of every quarter, I would give everybody in the room that's working together in this company, and this was about the size that we were and somewhat larger when we did this, $1,000 and a piece of software and 48 hours to anonymously give the $1,000 away to anyone else in the company in whatever manner or amount you choose, but not yourself. That job is for everybody else. So you decide in the quiet of your own room how you want to give away $1,000 to everybody else in the company. So you think, well, this would create all kinds of irrational outcomes. It doesn't. It creates an almost perfect assessment of performance inside the company. As the CEO of this company, and this was a big company and a successful company and one that I was responsible to very real investors for performance, I saw that this process worked incredibly well because it identified the people who we all knew were the high performers anyways and gave them bonuses, but it identified another handful of people who were ones we had never heard about, that I had never heard about as the CEO. But when I went and audited those results, when I went and investigated with their managers who these people were, I found that they were the key people keeping the company alive. And we were able to pay all those people those bonuses without any acrimonious debate about management, because your managers weren't involved. I, as the CEO, got $1,000 to give away. Curiously, the executive management team typically received less than everybody else. I guess that's a longer conversation, but so that's the second one. The third experiment was a simple thing that I did. Talk about we and valuing the executive team, the leadership, and how much does leadership matter. Well, the other thing I did when we got to a pretty sizable scale, and I started worrying about my own ability to run the company. Some of my experiments were so crazy, I didn't know whether. I sometimes questioned myself as to whether I should be running the company. And so one thing I started doing was I'd use a SurveyMonkey, an anonymous survey tool. And every 3 months, I'd send out a SurveyMonkey survey to everybody in my company. It had 2 questions on it. Question number 1, this was anonymous. I didn't save your IP addresses or anything. Question number 1, do you want to keep me as the CEO or get a new one? Yes or no? No middle. Question number 2 was, am I getting better or worse at the job? Regardless of whether you think you want to keep me or not, do you think I'm improving or getting worse? And the next day, I would share these results with everybody. So you can imagine what the participation rate was on this survey. But I would share these results with everybody. And in fact, I would trend line them. And I used to joke with my team. I used to say, well, someday, this company will outgrow me in some manner as CEO. And I also can promise you that I won't want to leave when that day comes. But you will have the data. You will have the trend line on these statistics. So that's a third example of something. All of these, in summary, are examples of using technology, as I started to say at the beginning, using technology, and in this case, transparency. Using technology and transparency to change the culture of the organization. Most particularly, and I mean, this is the why around, why would you do things like this? To empower people at lower levels in the company to be to take more risks and be more entrepreneurial and impactful inside the company without the fear, to empower them to do these things that traditionally you'd only see an individual doing when they're thinking about starting their company. I wanted to do that for everyone inside the company because I believed that the challenge we faced required that kind of a management style. But having done these experiments and used them successfully in a company, what I would say to all of you is I highly suspect that one form or another of this kind of extreme transparency and extreme sort of accountability is very likely to be the management techniques that we're going to see in the companies that you're going to go off and start. And I think they're economically effective techniques, so that means whether you like them or not, or whether they feel like a cultural fit or not, you will probably be forced by the overall marketplace to use them one way or another. Thanks.
And we've heard them, and when I say we, I say us Portuguese. We're a mainly Portuguese audience hearing this. And one conversation that I had when I was preparing these panels was very interesting with Tony, was where our culture, our Portuguese culture and business collides. And possibly it collides in management style, possibly it collides in many other ways, and that's exactly what Tony, Portuguese born but American raised, is going to tell us about. Tony.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here today. As as I suspected, you've heard some amazing insights and ideas from my distinguished co-panelists here. So, as Sophia said, I wanted to focus a little bit on stuff that's a little closer to home. I was educated and grew up in the United States, but tenho uma mãe portuguesa, which changes everything. Okay, so I grew up with a really deep understanding of Portuguese culture, born in my house and through things that they injected into me. And I found that in my own career, I had to overcome some aspects of what I believe are kind of inherent in the Portuguese culture to become successful in business in the United States. And so I wanted to share some of those insights because I think you may be feeling some of the same things that I felt and that I had to overcome. So I broke it down into 10 elements that I think really, in the spirit of this talk, capture the essence of what Silicon Valley is about, especially in relation to teams and building companies. So we can make this an interactive thing, if you'd like. If you hear something that's accurate, you can clap. And if you hear something that's controversial, you can boo. That's totally cool. And because it would be feedback for me, and it would be interesting for me to learn as well. All right, so let's get into this. So item number 1 is the ability to question the status quo. I think that's inherent in the Silicon Valley culture. And I would argue that it's something that's native to the Portuguese culture as well. I've yet to come across somebody who's satisfied, say, with the way the government works here, or the way the state of the economy. And if you talk to Portuguese taxi drivers, you can hear a litany of issues of why the status quo is unacceptable. So I think just as a culture, you have a tendency to question things. So to me, that's a critical aspect of the leadership that's required for an entrepreneurial experience and for a successful company. So you get a bullseye on that one. All right? All right, you agree with that? All right. See, I just wanted to get applause, so this is my big contrived presentation for that. All right, on the second one, you have to work really hard. I think a lot of people, for whatever reason, when they get into an entrepreneurial situation, they have this idea in their minds that life's going to become easier and they actually have to work less. And in my experience, you have to work a lot harder because in my own experience, I'm the worst boss I've ever had, you know? Because when I'm dealt with bosses in a corporate context, I could rationalize, weave around the issues, and come up with rationale for maybe getting out of things. But, you know, as a founder, as being a leader of a company, and the requirement is that you need to get on a plane even though you're not feeling well, and your kid's going to be in the play that night, and, you know, et cetera, you've got to do it anyway. And I believe the Portuguese populace is a very hardworking populace. So. All right, I haven't hit any boos yet. So you get a bullseye on that one. All right, third, creativity. I think it's an absolutely essential part of a successful tech company in particular. And as they say, Portugal é país de poetas, right? And I think if you look at the quality of design and art in Portugal, it's fantastic. And in fact, I mean, just walking around the airport, looking at the industrial design, looking at the graphic design that Portuguese companies produce, I would argue that it's in many ways superior to what I see being produced in the US. I think it's much more modern, much more progressive, and there's much more of a spirit of achieving, you know, let's call them postmodern experiments. And in some ways, that element of creativity is essential to a successful business. I think it's essential to creating a successful organization, and you have that in spades as well. Okay. There's not enough controversy. You've got to get those boos ready here. Okay. All right. Oop. Is that another creative? All right. The other thing, too, is that if you haven't caught on, I think building a new business and running any kind of organization is inherently a social process. As you've heard from other sessions, when you deal with issues of acquiring capital, et cetera, it's all about people-to-people communication. You don't go into givemeatonofmoney.com and all of a sudden, you know, get something going into your bank account. It's a very personal, it's a very social activity. And I know the Portuguese culture to be a very social culture. So you really have that going for you. I think there are some aspects where the culture can be a little bit too insular. That's a whole other issue. But it's a very social culture. You have the willingness and the ability to talk and express your opinion, and that's an essential part of managing an organization and being an entrepreneur. So you get a bullseye on that one. All right. Now is where it gets tough. So let's talk about other attributes of successful leaders in organizations and successful entrepreneurs. They're inherently optimistic and self-confident. Okay, in Silicon Valley, you know, you don't come across anybody, you know, who's out, you know, trying to build a company and going through all this work and kind of, well, you know, I'm not so sure about this, you know, maybe, you know. And, you know, for me, you know, growing up, you know, at least, you know, having a Portuguese mother, you know, you get these little demons in your head clicking away, like, tu tens que ser homem responsável. Não podes fazer isto. You know, that kind of stuff. And, you know, it's stuff that wears away at your own self-confidence. And this is an area where I think you need to realize, just culturally, you know, it is an inherent part of the culture, I would argue, but it's a trait that you need to develop and that you need to overcome. Okay? So you don't. Okay. Good. So no bullseye on that one. Sorry. The other one is, you know, there's a tremendous amount of creativity and ideas here. I've seen amazing things come out of research universities here. I've seen inventions playing out here that I've never seen anywhere else. And unfortunately and sadly, because of a lack of marketing and thinking strategically about how you turn some of those inventions into products, they'll probably never see the light of day. And I think, if there's any area in particular where Portugal could really, just as a culture, and for you individually, thinking about your businesses, should really put a lot of emphasis in thinking through how are you going to put the dog food in front of the dog, in really interesting ways. And, the old channels of buying expensive advertising, et cetera, are really going by the wayside. It's a much more social environment. It's a much more guerrilla marketing type environment. And those are skills, that I think need to be injected right into the education system. Students studying engineering here, for example, should have multiple marketing courses. They should have sales courses, I would argue, because it's an inherently important part of entrepreneurship. All right? Okay, separating business and personal. Okay. This is a tough one, because, as you all know, I think the Portuguese populace is a populace with a lot of feeling. There's a lot of emotion and passion. And, and that passion is sort of like TNT. You can use it to save a lot of work in the mine, or you can kill thousands of people. It really depends on how you use it. And, I think there's this particular issue is an important one. It impacts both, I think, your sense of leadership. It also impacts the way you come across other people, especially companies in the United States. And it comes out in a lot of really interesting ways that you don't realize. For example, it comes out in a form of, okay, I'm giving somebody some honest feedback about issues in Portugal or issues in a business or whatever, and there's this moment of silence, and it's like, nós temos o melhor algodão do mundo. O nosso... criamos mais rolha do que qualquer parte do mundo. And, all of a sudden, when you start providing objective feedback, it turns into almost a personal attack, And one of the things that I think is hard for Americans in particular to realize is how big that separation is from the personal, from the business. That you do whatever you need to do for your business, and there's issues of morality and ethics that we could talk about at length. But that's whatever happens there is different from personal life. And I think for Portuguese culture, I think that's a tougher separation. But it's an essential separation. You really need to think of your business and what you need to do, especially within your team and your organization, as something that's different from your feelings. And as was mentioned earlier, doing things like hiring your friends and stuff makes it even more difficult to address some of those issues. Just culturally, it's hard. So it's, in many ways, it's best to just not go there. Oh, all right, good. And I think this is the last one, is perseverance. I don't think it is the last one, actually, now that I think of it. Perseverance, I think because of the self-confidence issue, and I would say, I think Portuguese in general sell themselves really short. I think a lot of Portuguese people think that they're uniquely unsettled by the daunting task of building a business, or they're uniquely unsettled by the insecurity of what it means to be an entrepreneur. And in fact, everybody feels that way. They feel that way in the US, and guess what? As your business gets more successful, you only get more of those feelings in a way, because you know that there's more to lose, you're much more responsible for people's livelihoods, etc. And so, you culturally need to overcome the resistance to this feeling of, not wanting to feel that lack of that comfort, that discomfort. That discomfort, in my mind, is what growth feels like. Okay, and I think culturally, it's easy to kind of shy away from it as a Portuguese person because, it just doesn't feel right. You don't want to feel that kind of angst. So there's a lot of instances that I've seen of people will just give up, and they'll give up too early. Okay? Truth hurts, doesn't it? Okay. And lastly, personal risk related to the perseverance. I think there's a lot of pride in Portugal, and rightly so, for a lot of things, both historical and current. But, as you've heard from these gentlemen and you've heard from others, entrepreneurship is all about risk. You're risking money, you're risking your time, you're risking, in some cases, your career because you've left a corporate environment. And you need to get used to the fact that as an entrepreneur, you're going to be dealing with a lot of risky issues. And this is also, I think, an area of problem for a lot of Portuguese people that I come across, because nobody wants to be come across as a failure. Nobody wants to feel like they in front of their family that they tried something and didn't quite get there. Somebody mentioned in a talk, I think it was yesterday, about creating a separation to allow you to fail, and there's really something to that. There's I think you need to accept the fact that failure is a good thing, because that's what learning feels like too. That's what learning is all about. If you're not failing, if you're not falling and stumbling, then you're not learning. Somehow you've inherently been born with all the right information, and you're doing all the right things, which I don't know about you, but it certainly isn't true for me. So those are my thoughts. So hope you enjoyed those. Thank you.
Breaking from lunch, and I would like to open questions to the audience. We've got a microphone here and a little helper. So questions, one right there.
Hello there. Basically, wow, really loud. I think culturally, we also talked about in the other room about academia meets the real world. Is the problem that Portuguese tend to envy entrepreneurs, and like the last speaker said, when you have a Portuguese mother like mine, you always see high-end cars on the street, and you always assume that's from a drug dealer or someone in a shady business. And that's something that we have culturally, and I don't think it's going to change. I've been in the U.S. For 6 months, and I can see that everyone there has a kind of a dream. Even the simplest person has a dream. I had a teacher that they had a dream of making a cake bakery of some sorts, and she never gave up on the dream. She was working on Disney. She had a high hierarchical job, but she was still dreaming of making her own business. In Portugal here, we all have dreams like everyone else, but every time we speak about our dreams with someone else in our family, our circle of friends, everyone says, nah, that's kind of risky, you probably won't get finance for that or something like that. And I don't know what
question?
The question.
Thank you very much for your comment. Do you have a question?
What can we do to change that? Is there any tools that we can have, any concept, any framework we can have to show other people that our ideas might come true?
Coming to Silicon Valley comes to this.
I don't know how to fix that, but I do think that the risk, and I think it's a good point that the flip side of risk is embracing success, and I think that is true. I've seen that in my world travels, that it is unusual how in the United States having a lot of money is seen as a good thing. And this seems to not be true in most other cultures. And it is an interesting problem, because to embrace the risk inherent in entrepreneurship, which is failure. We've been listening to presentations from entrepreneurs here in Lisbon. It's fantastic to listen to the ideas. The ideas, like great ideas anywhere nowadays, are wonderful, and I've heard some incredible ones. Most of the people, though, that I heard present to me said that they had a job and they were waiting to get funding so that they could quit their regular job. Let me tell you one thing. Maybe I'm wrong about this, but there's not a single investor in Silicon Valley who would invest in you. Because that is a critical indicator that you're not ready. You're not fearless enough you're not ready to take on the risk. When you go to raise the money, you need to have already quit your job. You need to be saying, I'm here, I'm doing this, I'm not going back. So I think rewarding tremendous levels of success with reverence in a society, it's an interesting problem, because I think that is what motivates people in America, is the idea that we like Larry and Sergey at Google. We think it's cool that they're worth billions of dollars. We don't look at them and go, oh, it's kind of dirty. You know?
Well, just one quick thought. As my career advanced and I did certain things that for my mother felt like they were outside her comfort level, I'd always hear the phrase, "Isso é para ricos," right? And that means that's for the rich. So, my point in my presentation isn't to come here and tell you that Portugal needs to recreate the Silicon Valley society, because I don't think it's going to happen. It's not realistic. My point is, you need to know where you fit in relation to it. So, when you try to yield the greatest gain out of the kind of factors that have led to the success in Silicon Valley, part of it is you need to do some introspection and realize where your strengths aren't. And I think in your case, there are elements of the culture that you just need to understand, because it's critical to understand how those things are going to come across to other people that you deal with, especially when you go to the US, how that can be misinterpreted because it's native to your own culture, but it's just totally alien to the way people think.
We have time for one more question. There's a hand right there. Maybe you could just say it.
Have you got any advice for managing issues in family teams? For example, if you've got a very close-knit team, and sometimes you might know there's a problem, but as you're raising that problem and trying to deal with it, because you're very dedicated to such a close team, have you got any suggestions for managing that?
And I'll say that's part of the separation of business and your personal life. And, my own philosophy in my own business, for example, is, we're there collectively as long as it makes sense for all of us individually, And we need to, the only way we're going to succeed, short-term and long-term, is to have no wall between us in terms of being honest. And I think it's really, for me, from a management standpoint, it's setting a tone of honesty right from day one, and to make sure that people don't take that kind of honesty as an insult. Again, I think this is in the US, I think that's a lot easier, because everybody kind of knows where they are in relation to the organization. I think here it is a little bit tougher, but I think for me it's really about establishing a culture of honesty within the organization.
Well, explicitly, there's a couple things. With respect to founders' equity, which is the allocation of interest in the company between a series of founders, one appealing situation is one where they can all agree to have the same equity in the company. That is compelling, because there's no fighting then over it. If the distribution is unequal, though, which is very frequent, in many cases there's a difference in skill or contribution, the thing I always try to come up with is a way where you can let time go by and then decide with a lot of transparency, looking back on what happened, what the proportions should be. This is difficult to do sometimes with respect to tax and stuff, but I always like the idea of really pushing a set of founders to actually do work for each other, and then valuing the quality of that work afterwards, rather than sitting up front and trying to decide whether you're
your marketing skills are more important than my engineering skills. I think that's almost an unsolvable problem.